You never truly know your neighbors until one of them steals your identity, uses your HOA to forge legal documents, tries to ruin your life with a smile. And that's exactly what happened to me when Karen Preston became president of the Cedar Ridge HOA. Before I tell you how I ended up in court fighting to prove that I wasn't the criminal she claimed I was, do yourself a favor, subscribe to Sham Stories right now, because what I'm about to reveal isn't just another HOA nightmare. It's a warning that anyone living in a homeowners association could be one board vote away from losing everything. I moved into Cedar Ridge 2 years ago, freshly divorced, ready for a quiet life, and unaware that the woman who dropped off a welcome basket at my door would eventually weaponize the very system she pretended to represent. Karen was the kind of neighbor who baked cookies and smiled too much. But behind her floral blouses and charity luncheons was a meticulous manipulator with a clipboard and a plan. She ran unopposed for HOA president the year before I arrived and had spent her time quietly consolidating power-merging committees, rewriting outdated bylaws, and transferring all HOA correspondence to a digital system she personally controlled. At first, she seemed efficient, even helpful. She reminded people about garbage days, sent out reminders for dues, and even organized spring cleanup weekends. But once I settled in, the cracks started to show. I got a violation letter for weeds that didn't exist, then another one for having a gutter that was allegedly too reflective. I paid the minor fines, assuming it was just the price of living in a tidy neighborhood, but then I started noticing that none of my neighbors were getting the same letters. In fact, many hadn't received any violations in months. I asked around casually and got vague responses, awkward laughs or warnings to just stay on her good side. That's when I started digging. The HOA portal required a resident login to access meeting notes, budgets, and violation records, but my login never worked. When I requested a reset, the system claimed I didn't have an account even, though I was paying dues monthly. I contacted Karen, who assured me it was just a system glitch and that she'd take care of it. 2 days later, I got a new login, but all the past meeting notes were blank and my violation history had been wiped. That's when I knew something was wrong. I created a dummy email and requested access as a new resident. The system instantly generated a new user portal one that showed full documents, monthly expenses, and a list of residents who had been fined or warned in the past 2 years. My name was at the top of nearly every list. According to the system, I had been cited over a dozen times, fined over $2,400, and had multiple warnings on record for infractions ranging from improper porch lighting to unsanctioned exterior color maintenance, none of which were real. But the most disturbing discovery came when I found a document in the HOA files labeled Escrow Transfer Authorization, Lot 11B. My lot, my name, my forged signature. The document stated that I had authorized the HOA to oversee property transfer proceedings related to a secondary holding in trust through a shell company named Oak Sentinel Management. I stared at the screen for 10 minutes, heart pounding. I had never heard of that company, hadn't transferred anything, but the signature looked almost exactly like mine, where Curran had countersigned it. I printed everything I could, documented the site, and took screenshots of every page. I brought it all to the county property office the next day and asked to see any active filings on my home. The clerk pulled up the records and went pale. "There's an active lien," she said, her voice shaking. "You didn't authorize this?" I shook my head. No, I didn't authorize anything. The lien had been filed 6 weeks prior, through a third-party collection firm acting on behalf of Oak Sentinel Management. The claim stated that I had failed to pay $2,850 in HOA-related property fees, and that my title was now partially controlled by the association pending resolution. My mouth went dry. This wasn't just a violation letter. This was identity fraud on a scale I'd never imagined. I drove straight to the police department with my file, where I spent 3 hours with an officer explaining the timeline. The moment I mentioned Karen's name, he stiffened. "You're not the first person to mention her," he said carefully. But no one's had evidence that sticks." I dropped the folder on the table. "Now you do." He nodded and promised to escalate it to the Financial Crimes Division. Meanwhile, I started receiving emails anonymous at first, then from someone claiming to be a whistleblower. The subject line read, "She's done it before." The message included 2 addresses in nearby counties, both properties listed under Oak. Sentinel Management LLC, both formerly owned by elderly residents who had moved away unexpectedly. I did a little research and found old neighborhood forums. One mentioned Karen Preston as the former HOA secretary in one of those neighborhoods before she relocated for personal reasons. It was the same pattern: rapid leadership updated, bylaws, and sudden property disputes. Karen had made a career of HOA manipulation. The next week, I was served with papers official notice from a private legal firm hired by Oak Sentinel claiming I owed them over $5,000 in back fines and processing fees. The court date was in 2 weeks. I handed the papers to my new attorney, a local expert in HOA litigation who had also heard Karen's name before. "She's clever," he said. "She doesn't steal your money. She creates false compliance, structures, manipulates signatures, and waits until you're too entangled to fight back. Most people just settle. That's how she wins." But I wasn't going to settle. I had hard proof, and now I had legal backup. We filed a counterclaim, included the forged documents, the HOA discrepancies, and a full timeline of Karen's violations. The moment the subpoena landed in Karen's mailbox, things escalated. I found my tires slashed. My water bill doubled. Mysteriously, someone reported me to the city for unauthorized electrical work. The city inspection, of course, found nothing. It was psychological warfare. But what Karen didn't know was that I had installed 4 hidden cameras, 2 facing the street. One in the porch light and one in the birdhouse she had once mocked me for installing. 3 nights before the court date, those cameras caught her walking up to my door at 2:17 a.m. with a file folder in hand. She looked both ways, crouched near my mailbox, and placed something inside. In the morning, I found an envelope marked "Final Notice" from Oak Sentinel Management threatening immediate foreclosure. My name was misspelled. The address line was partially wrong. It was the sloppiest forgery yet, and it was caught on tape. I handed the footage to my attorney, who included it in the court filing. The hearing was brief. Karen showed up in full pastel regalia, a soft blue blouse, matching pumps, a string of pearls, and an attitude like she still believed she was untouchable. But once the judge saw the evidence, especially the video, her composure cracked. Court ruled in my favor, dismissed all liens, froze Oak Sentinel's ability to act on any HOA-related documents pending further investigation. Karen left the courtroom in silence. But it wasn't over. The district attorney's office had received copies of the files and opened a criminal investigation. The charge: fraud through administrative authority. It carried potential jail time. I returned home that day to find my porch flooded with supportive notes from neighbors who had suspected her but never had the courage to speak up. One of them, an elderly woman from 3 doors down, said, "She tried to do the same thing to me last year. I didn't have proof. I just left. I'm so glad you stayed and fought." And I realized then that it wasn't just my story. It was our story. Karen had abused the HOA, not to keep the neighborhood safe, but to build a quiet empire of fear and forgery. She had stolen identities, manipulated trust, and relied on silence. But now she'd been exposed. And if you want more stories where truth takes down tyranny, where everyday people fight back against abuse in the quiet corners of their lives, subscribe to Sham Stories now. You're going to want to hear how this ends. After the courtroom victory, I expected Karen Preston to retreat quietly, maybe even resign from her HOA position in shame, but I underestimated just how deep her obsession with control ran. If anything, the ruling only fueled her desperation, as if being challenged in public had fractured some illusion of invincibility she'd built around herself for years. The very next HOA bulletin, typically sent out monthly and filled with garden tips and community reminders, was replaced with a strange passive-aggressive manifesto. It didn't mention me by name, but referred to malicious actors attempting to destabilize neighborhood harmony through legal theatrics. She framed herself as a victim, spinning the story into one of personal betrayal and misunderstood actions taken in defense of community values. The worst part: some residents believed her. A small faction, mostly older homeowners, who'd benefited from Karen's favoritism, waived landscaping rules, overlooked violations, access. 2 early meeting notes began organizing informal gatherings to show support for the president. Meanwhile, others were just too exhausted or intimidated to push back. A kind neighbor of mine, Joseph, a widower who'd lived in Cedar Ridge for over 20 years, confided in me one evening that he'd once received a notice saying his property was under review for decorative inconsistencies. When he asked Karen about it, she told him it was probably a clerical error, and the notice was never officially filed. He shredded it and moved on, but now wondered if that had been the beginning of her manipulation campaign against him, too. I encouraged him to write a statement, and he agreed. Slowly, quietly, the momentum started building. I worked with my attorney and a local investigative journalist to begin compiling a dossier on Karen's actions, not just what happened to me, but across the community. The journalist Evelyn Grant had written exposes on public corruption before, and once she got wind of Karen's scheme, she dove in like a bloodhound. Within a week, she uncovered records showing that Karen had submitted multiple board expense reports marked confidential that routed money to a software consultant firm based out of Nevada. The firm had no website, no phone number, and was connected to a P.O. box registered under Karen's maiden name. This wasn't just power abuse anymore, it was financial fraud with digital cover. Meanwhile, Karen became increasingly erratic. She began showing up uninvited at homes of residents who had spoken out, knocking on doors with a fake smile and an envelope labeled HOA clarification notice. Inside was a letter demanding that the residents stop spreading unsubstantiated claims that defamed the integrity of the board. Some people ignored her, others got scared. One woman down the block, a single mom named Rachel, broke down crying at my kitchen table because Karen had told her that any resident caught slandering board leadership could be fined or evicted under an updated compliance clause. That clause didn't exist. Karen had made it up. But because she controlled the HOA website and digital records, she could upload and delete documents as she pleased. She created a file with a fake clause, downloaded it to a PDF, printed it, and handed it to Rachel like it was law. The audacity would have been laughable if it hadn't been so effective. Most people weren't lawyers. They didn't have time to cross-reference legal language or verify digital timestamps. They just assumed that what Karen handed them was real land. That's exactly what she counted on. But she'd made a mistake when she came after Rachel. Because Rachel worked as a paralegal for a local family law firm, and once she regained her footing, she knew exactly how to document, date, and challenge what Karen had done. She joined our effort, bringing with her not just expertise, but a network of legal professionals willing to review every fake notice, every violation, every alleged signature. By the 3rd week after the court ruling, we had collected 23 statements from residents who had experienced fraud, threats, or suspicious documents originating from Karen's desk. Still, the HOA board did nothing. Technically, she was still their president. The board had the power to remove her, but with Karen controlling access to internal records, board emails, and meeting schedules, it was nearly impossible to organize a formal vote without her knowing and interfering, so we took another route. Evelyn's article went live. It was titled "The Queen of Cedar Ridge: How One Woman Used an HOA to Control a Neighborhood." And it hit the local news circuit like a lightning bolt. Within 48 hours, it had been shared over 2,000 times in neighboring communities. Began commenting, some claiming similar experiences with Karen in previous neighborhoods. It triggered a full audit from the county's Homeowners Association Regulatory Committee, who showed up to the next board meeting with badges and binders. Karen tried to delay the meeting, claiming a security concern, but the board, now under public pressure, overruled her. For the first time since I moved in, the clubhouse was packed. Neighbors who'd been silent for months showed up, some holding printouts of Evelyn's article, others clutching copies of fake notices they'd saved, but never questioned. Karen walked in late, holding a large binder and wearing sunglasses. Indoors, she claimed it was a migraine. She tried to take her usual seat at the head of the table, One of the committee officials stepped forward and handed her a notice of temporary suspension pending investigation. Her hand shook as she read it. The room was silent. Then, from the back, Joseph stood and asked the question no one else dared say aloud. "Karen, did you steal our names?" She didn't answer. She just sat down and stared at the folder in front of her. The meeting continued without her. One by one, residents stood and shared their experiences. Someone had paid a $400 fine for a hedge that didn't violate code. Another described a forged approval letter they never signed. Each story was another crack in the facade Karen had spent years building. The regulatory officials took notes, collected copies, and promised an expedited review. Karen left before the meeting ended. I saw her walking to her car, clutching her binder like it was a lifeline. That night, she removed herself from the HOA portal. Her name disappeared from the contact list. No official statement. No apology. Just gone. But we knew better than to celebrate. People like Karen don't just disappear, they regroup. Sure enough, a week later, 3 residents received cease and desist letters from a new law firm in the city. The letters were aggressive, citing defamation, breach of confidentiality, and threats of civil litigation. We traced the firm and discovered it had a single client on file, Oaks Sentinel Management LLC. Karen had reactivated the shell company. She was trying to use it as a legal shield, but we were ready. The legal team Rachel had built drafted a counterclaim. So solid, the firm dropped her as a client within days. Then the county's investigation report was released. It detailed gross negligence, manipulation of financial documents, and unauthorized access to private homeowner data. It didn't explicitly accuse Karen of criminal behavior. That was up to law enforcement, but it recommended her permanent removal from any HOA leadership roles and suggested the community seek restitution through civil court. Karen's reign was over, at least officially. The HOA board elected a new interim president, a quiet man named Glenn, who had once been too intimidated to attend meetings. Now he stood confidently behind the podium, promising monthly transparency updates and third-party audits for all future budgets. The neighborhood began to breathe again. But I still double-checked my mail, still scanned every notice for signs of forgery. Karen may have been removed, but her damage lingered. Her fear-based system had become embedded in our routines, in our expectations, in the very way we saw our homes. Undoing that would take time. It was a slow rebirth, but it had begun. And if there's one thing I learned through it all, it's that the scariest monsters don't break into your home at night. They smile at your front door, hand you a welcome basket, and ask if they can be your HOA president. Weeks passed, and the scars Karen had left behind remained fresh in the hearts and minds of nearly every resident of Cedar Ridge. Even as her name slowly disappeared from official HOA records, meeting minutes, and email rosters. But people don't forget betrayal, so is a line knot, when that betrayal came from someone who had shaken their hands, complimented their front lawns, and then quietly filed forged violations and faked financial reports behind their backs. The new interim president, Glenn, did his best to steady the ship. He reinstated public HOA votes, scheduled weekly in-person office hours at the clubhouse, and launched a full digital rebuild of the resident portal, this time with security features that prevented any one person from having complete administrative control. He even requested third-party consultants to review the past 2 years' financial reports to identify any remaining inconsistencies. But despite the administrative improvements, the emotional tension in the neighborhood simmered under the surface. Karen might have been gone from her position, but her ghost lingered in every conversation about policies, every inspection notice, every friendly smile that residents second-guessed. People began to see conspiracy in ordinary reminders, suspicion in every HOA update, and doubt in the intentions of even well-meaning board members. That's how deep her corruption ran. It had rewired our sense of community. What made matters worse was that Karen wasn't exactly gone. Though stripped of her official powers, she still lived in the neighborhood, still parked in the same driveway, still walked her poodle in the evenings like nothing had ever happened. She waved at people who wouldn't look back, left passive-aggressive posts on neighborhood social pages under anonymous usernames, and once even offered to assist with a landscaping project outside the clubhouse. Glenn politely declined. Of course, but her offer made the board tighten procedures even more. I kept my distance, not out of fear, but out of strategy. I knew that if Karen was going to retaliate again, it would be through some convoluted channel that kept her hands clean. I wasn't wrong. One morning, Rachel forwarded me a strange email she received from a real estate brokerage. The message claimed her home was part of a pending portfolio listing being arranged through a private housing management trust. It included no attachments, no official letterhead, just a vague paragraph and a contact number. Curious, Rachel dialed it from a burner phone. The woman who answered said she represented Cedar Ridge Properties. And when Rachel asked why her home was involved, the woman hesitated, then hung up. That name Cedar Ridge had never come up before. We searched public records and found it tied to a Delaware-registered trust, non-transparent and faceless, much like Oak Sentinel had been. It didn't take long to realize that Karen was likely involved. Cedar Ridge was her new cover, a fresh LLC, where she could try again what had failed under Oak Sentinel. Only this time, she was casting a wider net. 3 more neighbors received similar emails that week. 2 of them were renters with pending renewals. 1 was a retiree looking to sell her home quietly. Karen, it seemed, had evolved. She wasn't targeting people overtly anymore. She was looking for gaps. Moments of vulnerability, cracks she could slip through legally without ever touching an HOA document. She was trying to manipulate the housing market from behind the scenes. I took everything to Evelyn, the journalist. She was already midway through a follow-up story and took the new evidence seriously. With Rachel's help, we connected the email address to a temporary domain name purchased using a privacy-shielded registrar. But Evelyn had sources. Through her contacts in real estate media, she traced back in metadata to an IP range that matched. A property Karen's cousin owned 3 towns over. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was close. At the same time, the county's investigation team filed a motion requesting full access to any shell companies associated with Cedar Ridge HOA transactions. That included Oak Sentinel and eventually Cedar Ridge. Karen must have gotten wind of it because her behavior changed again, utterly but noticeably. Her once pristine yard became neglected. The porch lights remained off. She skipped walking the dog. Some whispered she had lawyered up again, this time with a high-profile defense attorney known for handling white-collar cases. But none of that stopped the residents from pushing forward. Glenn announced a community-wide restoration plan not just for landscaping and infrastructure, but for trust. He proposed an HOA Truth and Reconciliation Committee, a kind of neighborhood hearing where residents could share their experiences, grievances, or even apologies in a structured, dated environment. It wasn't mandatory, but the idea struck a nerve. Dozens signed up. Over the next month, the clubhouse transformed into a place of stories. People brought forward copies of notices they'd received, emails they'd questioned, suspicions they'd buried. One man tearfully confessed that he'd once forwarded a neighbor's violation to Karen, hoping to get a favor in return. Another admitted she'd been complicit in approving budget changes she didn't understand. It was raw, honest, and surprisingly healing. I shared my story too, not just the legal case, but the emotional toll, the anxiety, the disbelief that something so malicious could come from someone so familiar. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then, someone started clapping. Others joined. It wasn't applause for me, it was relief, a shared release of fear that had lived in our bones for too long. The committee collected all the testimonies, all the documents, and formed a community archive, encrypted and transparent, available to all residents. New bylaw was voted into place that required term limits for HOA officers, mandatory audits every 6 months, and a resident committee with veto power over major decisions. Karen's empire was not just dismantled, it was replaced with a fortress of accountability. But even as this structure of trust emerged, the legal storm was still gathering. The county prosecutor had begun reviewing Evelyn's latest article. Alongside the community evidence archive, they confirmed that at least 5 homeowners had been contacted through Cedar Ridge in a way that constituted property misrepresentation and preemptive claim solicitation, a violation of state housing code. Karen was subpoenaed again, and this time she didn't attend the hearing alone. Her attorney argued that she had simply created investment pathways and that all outreach had been done through legal channels. But the court saw through it. The judge ordered a temporary freeze on all property-related LLCs connected to her or her family, pending full review. For the first time since her original defeat, Karen looked shaken. Her eyes darted around the courtroom. She kept whispering to her lawyer. Her pastel suit looked wrinkled, like she hadn't slept in days. This wasn't the HOA anymore. This was the legal system, and it wasn't hers to control. The judge also imposed a ban preventing her from engaging in any real estate solicitation in the county, personally or through an entity, for 12 months. As the courtroom emptied, Karen remained seated, staring at nothing. She had tried to rebuild her dominion in the shadows. But the community had become something she never anticipated: alert, unified, and resilient. That evening, as I returned home, I passed by a neighbor's house and saw something on their front lawn, a simple wooden sign that read, "We remember." Below it were clipped photos from the first newsletter we'd received post-Karen with handwritten notes of hope, apology, and gratitude. It wasn't just a neighborhood anymore, it was a community again. But I couldn't help but feel we hadn't seen the last of her. People like Karen don't give up, they wait, they adapt. If she ever tried again, in Cedar Ridge or elsewhere, we'd be ready. Because now we knew the cost of silence and the power of standing together. As spring turned to summer, in Cedar Ridge, the air felt different, lighter, warmer not just in temperature, but in tone. For the first time in over 2 years, people began to live without looking over their shoulders. Kids rode bikes past homes that used to feel like surveillance zones. Garden parties returned to backyards without Karen's looming approval. And simple neighborly conversations happened on porches instead of in whispers behind closed doors. But peace, as it turned out, came with its own complications. The community, in its efforts to clean up the damage Karen had left behind, was still unearthing more of what she'd buried. The deeper the Truth and Reconciliation Committee went into archived emails, forgotten meeting minutes, and buried HOA expense reports, the more they found hidden expenses, fabricated inspection logs, and private communications labeled board only, that had never been shared with the board at all. Some of the most damning files were found by a retired IT technician named Walter, who had previously worked for a cybersecurity firm and now volunteered to audit the HOA's digital infrastructure. What he discovered was a private subdomain buried beneath the public HOA website, accessible only through a hidden URL. On it were copies of original documents, sun-redacted homeowner histories, scanned driver's licenses, internal conversations about potential property takeovers, and in one shocking case, a signed and dated internal strike plan outlining exactly how Karen intended to push out 3 specific residents by triggering HOA violations in sequence. Walter immediately brought it to Glenn and the HOA board, who froze all further operations and notified the authorities. A second investigation was opened, this one not just into Karen's misdeeds, but into the very technology she'd used to carry them out. The County Digital Crimes Unit seized all servers related to the HOA site and subpoenaed the developers listed on the web infrastructure invoices. That's when the story widened even more. The developer, it turned out, was not some large agency, but a single freelancer named Adam Pike, a quiet man in his mid-30s who operated under the brand name Pike Property Tech. When investigators reached out to him, he admitted that Karen had requested specific features like hidden admin access, user suppression tools, and even location-based data tracking for mobile logins. Adam claimed he didn't realize she was using them maliciously. He thought he was building compliance tools, but his code proved otherwise. The tracking software flagged users who logged in more than twice in 24 hours, automatically marking them for overengagement, a term Karen had coined to monitor anyone asking too many questions. Every violation report printed from the system had metadata that showed it was edited at least once often, just minutes before being sent. And most disturbingly, The scanned signatures used for board approvals came from a document folder labeled MISC consents, most of which were unverified or outright fabricated. The evidence was damning. County officials launched formal fraud charges against Karen Preston and recommended Adam Pike for federal review. The community watched in shock as the quiet man behind the keyboard became an accidental accomplice in one of the most extensive small-scale HOA data abuse cases the state had ever seen. Karen, still residing on her property but stripped of all community roles, was now a defendant in a criminal case. Her lawyer argued she had acted in the best interest of the community and had merely used available tools to ensure order and safety. But no one believed that anymore. What she had done wasn't management, it was manipulation at the software level. Meanwhile, something else began to shift in the neighborhood. As people learned the full extent of Karen's control, they began opening up not just to the board or the committee, but to each other. Stories once kept in silence came pouring out. A teenage girl revealed that Karen had reported her for loitering near common property when she was just waiting for a friend to walk to school. An elderly man admitted he stopped attending meetings because Karen had accused him of sleeping through them and suggested he step aside for a more alert participant. A young couple shared that they delayed their wedding because Karen had told them. Community event parking was under review and refused to approve their backyard ceremony. These weren't just paperwork violations, these were people's lives chipped away by a woman whose need for control had crossed into obsession. Glenn and the board responded with grace and urgency. They launched a community mental health fund, offered free legal counseling for anyone impacted by the HOAs, passed decisions, and even commissioned a public memorial sculpture in the park lot for Karen. But for the resilience of the community, the sculpture, designed by a local artist, was abstract, twisted metal resembling a maze with a soft, blooming tree growing through the center. At its base, a plaque read, "We grew through it," became a symbol of everything we had survived, everything we refused to return to. On a more personal level, my life slowly returned to something resembling normal. I spent evenings gardening, weekends helping Rachel with her home renovation, and weekdays consulting with Evelyn on the broader HOA reform story she had begun pitching to national outlets. My own mailbox, once a source of dread, now brought only real mail. Neighbors waved again. Some even stopped to ask questions, to thank me for not giving up, or to offer help if ever needed. One morning I received a letter, not an anonymous threat or a forged document, but a handwritten note from the county attorney's office. They were moving forward with restitution proceedings. Karen would be required to pay fines to the HOA, and to any resident proven to have suffered financial harm due to her actions. It wouldn't undo the past, but it was something. Closure, maybe, at least legally. But then, just as the community was stabilizing, something unexpected happened. Evelyn received a tip from a former HOA board member from another state. He claimed Karen had used a different name 5 years earlier in a Florida development called Cypress Hollow, where several residents experienced similar fines, forced sales, and unexplained document errors. The HOA there had dissolved entirely. After a mass resignation, and the local press never connected the dots, but this man had kept screenshots, emails, even a photo of President K.L. Presley at a meeting. It was Karen. Different haircut, same face, same playbook. This changed everything. Karen's behavior wasn't a one-time collapse of moral judgment, it was a pattern. Deliberate scheme she had run more than once. Evelyn's national story gained new urgency. We worked together to compile every name, every signature, every document connected to K.L. Presley, Oak Sentinel, Century Ridge, and now a new shell company Evelyn discovered, Sunfield Partners. Each time, the LLCs followed the same formula. Registered in privacy states, no employees, no services, just vague property management language. The criminal charges against Karen now extended into multi-state fraud territory. Federal investigators became involved. Rachel and I were asked to testify at a grand jury hearing. Karen, once the queen of neatly pruned roses and pastel blazers, was now at the center of a federal investigation. Her face, once seen only on HOA newsletters, appeared in court sketches on local news broadcasts, Yet through it all, she remained silent. No statement.
Wow.
No apology. Not even a social post. She had retreated fully into her legal cocoon. The court date was set for September. The case would not just determine Karen's fate, but possibly set a precedent for how HOAs across the country were allowed to operate and be held accountable. Cedar Ridge, once a footnote in suburban real estate listings, had become a symbol of both the dangers of unregulated authority and the resilience of neighbors who chose to fight back. And deep down, I knew the trial wouldn't just be about Karen. It would be about every person who was ever afraid to hang a flag on their porch, who paid a fine they didn't owe, who stayed silent because they thought they were alone. We weren't alone anymore. We were a community again. And we were ready for whatever came next. The day Karen Preston stood in federal court, she wore a gray pantsuit, with none of the pastel charm that once softened her iron grip over Cedar Ridge. Her hair, once perfectly curled into tight little neighborhood authority spirals, hung limp at her shoulders, and her lips, previously so quick to smile at bake sales while plotting behind the scenes, were pressed into a hard line. The courtroom was full press residents, former HOA officials from multiple counties, even representatives from a national HOA regulatory task force. The trial had become bigger than us.
Bigger than Cedar Ridge.
It was now about exposing a system that allowed one woman to weaponize bureaucracy and digital tools to rewrite the meaning of homeownership. The prosecution laid out a timeline so damning, it was hard to believe it had happened in our quiet neighborhood. They presented financial records showing how Karen had funneled over $340,000 across various HOA LLCs, including Oak Sentinel, Century Ridge, and the newly revealed Sunfield Partners. They showed evidence of Karen's use of false signatures on legal documents to transfer property liens, and how she used custom-built software features to track and suppress login access to HOA portals, targeting those she labeled problematic. The judge listened patiently, interrupting only to clarify certain technical points about the data infrastructure and email authentication logs. Karen's defense tried to paint her as misguided, not malicious, a woman who took her duties too seriously in a time when neighborhood unity was falling apart. They argued she had acted under extreme pressure and never intended for things to escalate. But the jury didn't buy it. Neither did the community. On the witness stand, I recounted my entire experience, how a neighbor turned dictator nearly, stole my identity, my property, and my peace of mind. Rachel followed, testifying not only about her own harassment, but about the dozens of residents who had come to her with their own stories after reading the original article. Evelyn, the journalist, submitted all her records to the court, along with a testimony that connected Karen's fingerprints to 3 other HOA communities that had since collapsed under mysterious leadership withdrawals and legal irregularities. One by one, we watched the framework of Karen's empire crack and collapse under the weight of truth. On the final day of the trial, the judge addressed Karen directly. "Miss Preston," he said, "this court finds that you used your elected position not to serve your community, but to deceive it systematically, repeatedly, and without remorse. Your actions exploited trust, violated civil liberties, and created a digital blueprint for future abuse." It stops here. The sentence was a combined 12 years, 5 in federal custody, 7 on probation with a lifetime ban from holding any leadership or managerial role in any HOA, nonprofit, or community board in the United States. Karen didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She simply nodded, as though she had been bracing for this all along. As she was led from the courtroom, her gaze swept over the audience, on me for a moment, and I didn't flinch. I didn't glare, didn't smirk. I simply watched her go, because there was nothing left to say. The days that followed were filled with a quiet kind of celebration, not the kind with balloons or fireworks, but the soft relief that comes from waking up without a weight on your chest. The HOA installed a new digital system, this time open source, transparent, and run by a rotating resident council. Every financial report was public. Every vote was recorded. Trust had been shattered, but in its place, we built accountability. The neighborhood began to heal. Glenn was officially elected president with unanimous approval, and he declined a second term in advance, promising to support whoever came next. Walter led monthly workshops on digital safety for seniors. Rachel opened a nonprofit hotline for HOA abuse victims across the county. And Evelyn's national story triggered a federal review of HOA oversight laws, leading to the first draft of the Homeowner Protection and Transparency Act. Set to appear on the state legislative floor by the end of the year, Cedar Ridge became a symbol not of victimhood, but of victory. The sculpture in the park gained a new plaque. This is where we took our power back. People came from neighboring communities just to see it, to ask questions, to find out how they could protect themselves. I returned to my life. It's not unchanged, but perhaps more aware, more cautious, and strangely more connected. The neighborhood wasn't perfect. There were still disputes over fencing, dog barking, and who left trash bins out too long, but those things were now addressed with conversation, not citations. People trusted each other again, and Karen, she became a warning. Cautionary tale told at HOA onboarding meetings, a red flag searched on public records, wasn't a villain in a story anymore. She was a case file, a lesson, a chapter we survived. One evening, I walked Bella Rachel's golden retriever. I now helped care for when she traveled, and paused at the edge of the park. A group of kids were racing each other on scooters. Two elderly couples chatted over coffee. A father helped his daughter learn to ride a bike. And I realized this was what we were fighting for all along. Not just to stop Karen, but to reclaim community. To make it safe again, to live without fear in our own homes. And if you've ever wondered how far a little power can go in the wrong hands, or how strong a community can become when it refuses to stay silent, subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel, because there are more stories like this. Someone somewhere needs to know they're not alone.